Well, hello, and welcome to the Agrarian Renaissance podcast with Don Tipping. I'm Don Tipping, and we're here in my library, and we are going to explore the landscape of emergent solutions for regenerative culture through a series of monologues, but also interviews of people who are oftentimes off in the fringe, but have something significant to contribute to this discourse from their own empirical knowledge, from having been hands on doing work, building sustainable, regenerative, resilient community. And for this initial podcast, what I want to do is create some framing. And this is basically a condensed version of an essay I wrote a number of years ago, looking at the various pathways that we have available to us as human beings. And part of this was inspired by a wonderful essay by David Holmgren, who's the much overshadowed by Bill Mollison co-originator of the permaculture concept. But David Holmgren, instead of going and traveling the world to proselytize permaculture in the late 70s, early 80s, decided to put roots down and start a homestead with his wife, Sue, and their family in near Melbourne, Australia. And he wrote an essay in the time in the early 2000s when peak oil was really on anyone's mind who was paying attention and looking at resource depletion and what that means for our industrial civilization. He wrote an essay called Crash on Demand. And within that, he basically highlighted 4 pathways that are available to human beings. And the first one he called brown tech. And brown tech is basically what we're all doing. If you drive a car and use technology, you're doing brown tech. We're just use up all the resources. Our way of life is non-negotiable, to coin the phrase from Dick Cheney at the era of the first Iraq War. And it's using up the resources, just continuing status quo because we can. And those of us in the position of privilege around the planet, the industrialized, north, if you will, are in a position to do this with quite a bit of ease, with a lot of the impact externalized to our own experience, except through the news, which obviously can be manipulated and framed however you want. The second pathway he called green tech. And in a green tech future, it is things like environmental incentives, solar panels, LED lights, carbon credits, electric vehicles, this type of thing that, if you're here on the west coast of the United States, would be quite well epitomized by the state of California. In Europe, it would be epitomized by the Scandinavian nations like Sweden, Norway, and the like. Of the idea that, well, we can ameliorate our impact by conservation and going to renewables, this idea. Unfortunately, there's a thing called the Barlow Paradox, wherein the more energy we conserve, the more we tend to use. So an example would be, if for myself, like, oh, I have an electric vehicle. I've saved so much carbon from going in the atmosphere, I deserve an extra vacation to a tropical place. So all those nations, those green tech nations that have imposed all these sometimes quite significant environmental incentives or restrictions and controls, their net energy usage has all gone up across the board. And that's the paradox of that type of thinking. The third pathway is really seen in the transition town movement. Near me here, Willits, California would be a great example. Ashland, Oregon, where it's really the county scale. So you can see brown tech is nation scale, green tech is maybe state or province scale, and then the transition town movement is county scale. And that idea is like, oh, we'll pull together. We'll have grange co-ops, community infrastructure, community farmers markets, this idea of buying clubs, pooling resources. And many of those strategies make a lot of sense. And all of us are going to be employing different techniques, tools, and strategies at every point. The fourth one is the lifeboat strategy, which is, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but it seems like things are getting difficult, and I want to make sure I am not one of the people left out of getting on a lifeboat when the Titanic sinks. So it's build a lifeboat while we still have the resources of the brown tech, green tech, transition town level movement. And another thing in the transition town movement might be a maker space where maybe you have access to welding equipment or a community wood shop, this type of thing. These are really excellent things. I'm not trying to cast shade on it, nor was David Holmgren. It's more just a looking at things from patterns to details. But within that lifeboat movement, the preppers would go in there, those that are getting ready. And growing gardens and developing the infrastructure right within their home and or eco-village small community. So I was inspired by that type of thinking, and that initial essay I think came out somewhere around right before the 2008 financial collapse. And I looked at it as another lens of patterns. And in permaculture, we use a patterns to details view of reality. And I recently had the opportunity to see and hear Temple Grandin speak, and she talked about that most of us are auditory listeners. We can listen to words and construct mental pictures in our mind for a view of reality, but animals and autistic people are visual learners. They need to see, like, okay, here's a sign, then I do this. And checklist thinking works really well for that. So that's a bottom-up thinking. It is another type of patterns to details thinking or approach, whereas auditory learners is a top-down thinking of an overarching pattern to the actual techniques that you'll use. So the way I like to look at this, and this is where this term Agrarian Renaissance came from, I thought I coined the term, but upon researching the internet, others have used that term, but in a different framework. So just follow me and I'll share where I conceived of this. So the first pathway that most of us are in here, and I live in the United States, but I would say largely the global north, this is the thing, it's just the regular kind. I'll just do the regular thing. I'll have my nuclear family living in my house in my suburban neighborhood. I'll go to my 9-to-5 job, earn my money, have my 401k, buy 3 days worth of groceries at a time. This type of thinking, just regular. And many of us have done that or are doing that at this time, and it is a bit the default mode network. The second type of thinking, I think, would be seen in Bernie Sanders, that movement that happened during the 2020 presidential election, the lead up to that, of reform. We need radical reform, and this is possible using the democratic process to put progressive leaders in place that will help guide us from this trajectory that we're on, which is use up all the resources and the global south will suffer, but it's worth it for the global north. This idea that we can vote change in or be the change. And this has been a theme for a while. Obama ran on that whole principle of change and the idea that reform is possible. So that's a nice idea. History doesn't seem to bear this out. Then the third pathway, and you can see similar to David Holmgren's lens, this is ratcheting down a series of basically doing nothing to doing a little bit, like voting, I voted, to the next one would be revolution, of burn it all down. Smash capitalism, smash the patriarchy, tear it down. We need to dismantle these structures and rebuild. Anarchy sometimes smacks of this. In different ways, depending on how you're interpreting that. And revolutions are effective at fomenting change, but typically there's a period of where there is no centralized structure. So like currently you can go to the store and you can buy what you need, toothpaste or what have you. If you get in a car accident, an ambulance will take you to the hospital and you'll receive some degree of medical care. So if we think within a revolution, a good example might be when the Soviet Union pulled out of Cuba. And all of a sudden they went from having all the resources of the Soviet Empire to much less resources. So very quickly, 90% of the produce that was consumed within the city of Havana, the capital city of Cuba, was produced within the city limits because Castro moved in a revolutionary type of thinking and just said all food will be channeled through centralized food banks. We will all receive 2,000 calories a day. Enough to survive, but not really enough to thrive. So things like butter and cheese and milk were really scarce. Everybody lost a lot of weight, but no one starved. So sometimes revolutions can be benevolent and actually lead them to a place of greater resilience and sustainability. However, as part of that revolution, any landowner who had more than 160 acres was kicked out, and their land was privatized by the state, or not, or was nationalized and distributed to anybody that wanted to grow food could get it. Another amazing thing of that revolution, just while I'm on the topic, is that anybody that wanted to become a doctor could get that education for free. And Cuba has more doctors per capita than any country in the world and literally exports doctors. So that's a good example. Unfortunately, most revolutions lead to a place of collapse in which basic infrastructure is destroyed and the young, angsty element of the populace is let just run amok. And there isn't time to be like, wait a minute, we might need those dialysis machines. Do not burn down that facility because there are people who will die without them. Or we might need that nuclear power plant because it is what produces the electricity for this area. So revolutions are messy. So this is where we come to Renaissance. And this is from the French words conjunction to make anew, to think again, and anytime you see that prefix re is to do again. So like the word remember is to become a member of again. And as we use language, I think it's important to consider what do you mean by what you're saying. So much like the Beatles song Revolution, there's a lyric that goes, you say you want a revolution, we all just want to see the plan. So that is really easy to say, smash capitalism or whatever your rallying cry and a revolutionary mindset is, but rarely does that same voice that's saying that have a plan that actually meets the needs of the people and the other beings in the system. And I was actually just retelling this story today of when I was a young man and I was arguing with my grandfather, who was an engineer for Chrysler. And at that time, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Motown, the big Detroit automakers, did a lot of military contracting as well. So he designed tanks while he was at Chrysler. So he would hear all my anti-war rhetoric and all my anti-establishment rhetoric as a young man. And he would smash his fist on the table and say, that's all bullshit. Until you have a plan that works for everybody, then it's bullshit. And it took me a long time to come around to that's true. And that's where we need a renaissance. And that is following the thinking, in the words of Einstein, is the type of thinking that created the problem rarely is what will generate the new solutions. And by this extension, in full ownership of this, and I heard some folks in the intellectual dark web like Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jamie Wheel, Jim Rutt, people of this ilk, say, isn't it interesting that we think a bunch of intelligent white men, and I'm including myself as being intelligent, I don't know if I am, will come up with the solutions to the problems that a bunch of intelligent white men, centuries before created. And that does beg the question, maybe we need a different type of thinking like that Temple Grandin, visual thinking, bottom-up thinking. And I'll just give voice to one of my female heroines in this space is Nora Bateson, whose grandfather coined the term genetics. Her father was Gregory Bateson, who was a biologist. And she brings this all around. And this is very Renaissance thinking. Who will feed the babies? Like, all that sounds great. Who's going to feed the kids? And she's a mother, so that's bottom-up thinking. The baby's crying because they're hungry. I don't care how great your idea of installing LED lights in every house is, it's not working. But when I think of an agrarian renaissance, I go back to when, as Edward Abbey put it at one point, that when we were a nation of carpenters, builders, farmers, we met our own needs, and we had no need of government and government services. So similarly, an agrarian renaissance is looking at perhaps the regular kind doesn't work, perhaps reform doesn't work, or it just takes too long and the next political administration tends to undo what the advances the previous one did, and we've been kind of locked in this cycle my whole lifetime. And revolution rarely works, and we see that around the planet. Usually revolution, it creates an opening for some kind of strongman dictator to move in and seize power with guns and in military might. Is this idea of going back to the Dunbar number, and that is referring to an anthropologist whose last name was Dunbar, who, through looking at villages throughout time and the way our brain, our neural processes developed, was most likely in the context of interacting with about 150 to 200 people for most of our life. Maybe we'd meet other people, but on a regular basis, that's about who you're interacting with. So when we think of a village, like a small agrarian village, and this Renaissance to make anew, isn't that interesting that like an eco-village or your average large family reunion or wedding or gathering where we actually have social cohesion and we feel connected, seen, understood, is typically in this smaller group. And so that's my thinking, is this: what are the tools within our agrarian renaissance? For myself, this has taken form in education through permaculture and seed saving, and then we have a small seed company. And we do grow some food for perhaps about 50 to 150 people. But mostly we're looking at what are the village scale things that can be, unique to an area, that are relevant to that particular bioregion. Like we live in an ecology where madrone trees grow. So anyone who's burning with wood to heat their home, firewood, knows that madrone is the best wood. But all you got to do is drive a couple hundred miles north or south, and all of a sudden madrone is not part of the lexicon of what the renaissance of wood heat is for that area, or woodcraft. So this idea of the agrarian renaissance, that's the dojo, the arena within which this podcast we want to explore. Who's making cheese? Who's making soap? Who's making knives? Who's developed these tools and techniques that we know we'll need going forward? And start there. Let's start with developing the alphabet with which we can create a new language of relating to one another, our ecology, and a way to hand something off to the younger generations that's relevant, rather than this idea of like, oh, we're just going to like roulette style put it all on this political candidate or this new technology and hope to save the day. Go back to when we were resilient communities. And an example would be, and this is where I think of agrarian societies, were meeting their own needs by and large. Before the Social Security Act and all this, there were no social services. Communities took care of one another. The religious institutions in an area, churches or mosques or what have you, took care of the people that participated. Families took care of one another. And this idea of an agrarian village scale, and that village we can morph, and with the internet that can be just people of like-minded, possibly on the other side of the planet. So that is the hope, is to explore specific techniques that you can add to your tool belt and your medicine bag of what gives you hope to move forward and pierce through the darkness of these difficult times and see a pathway that includes you in the future, that is new, that is artful. And again, Renaissance can be a good time. It's a time of art and music and creativity. And by leaning into that, we stimulate others to do that and join what could be a really good time. So, thank you.